Thank you, Liz, Stu. It's a real pleasure to be here. And there's a kind of irony in it for me because I lived in Devon for almost 10 years, up until about a year ago. All the time I was here, I never met anybody who'd heard of the 3Ps, who was interested in it, who was working in that field. So I thought, to hell with it, I'm moving to London. Actually, for other reasons, I moved to London. And since then, I keep hearing about all these 3 principal events happening in Devon. So it's nice to be involved in one anyways. Just to give you a little bit of brief background, my work originally was in homeopathy. I trained in that in the early part of my life, worked in that field for about 15 years. I used to run a training school, actually, in homeopathy. That led me into working with people in a variety of other ways. Sometimes I was accused of coaching. Sometimes I was accused of doing NLP. I hadn't trained in either of those things. But my role became one of just trying to help people with what they were up against in life. And I was essentially borrowing whatever I could from wherever I could to try and help people more effectively. Eventually that journey led me to what we call the 3 principles, and that was the early part of 2011. And as Liz just said, the impact of that, both on my own life and also my professional life, was such that I very quickly let go of all the other tools and techniques that I'd been using for the previous decade or more. That's not to say that you have to do that, by the way. That's just what happened to me, is that it became apparent to me that there was something in this that was so simple and yet so profound that it didn't make sense to me anymore to do things that were more complicated. So as best I can in the time we've got, I'm going to give you what for me would be just a very, very sketchy overview of the 3 principles, and just talk a little bit about what it is and isn't, so you can get clear on that. And before I do that, I just want to say something about how we best learn this, because one of the puzzling things about it is that it's not a body of information which I or anyone else can teach you, and you kind of get it down and you memorize it and then you go off and apply it. It doesn't work like that, which actually is good news, because that means that you don't have to take notes, you don't have to remember anything that any of us say today. The reason being, we call it insight-based learning rather than information-based learning. All that means is that the takeaway value is what you see for yourself. And you may not see anything for yourself today that's particularly striking, but it might be that insight happens in the break, or while you're driving home, or next week, or sometime like that, because that's the nature of insight. Insight is simply that moment when you kind of go, oh yeah, you see something that you hadn't seen before. Something occurs to you, something dawns on you. We say the penny drops. It's that kind of learning. Now I know that doesn't sound like much, but I'm going to ask you to trust me on this point alone, that is actually what changes people's lives. When a person's consciousness moves just a little bit and they see something that they haven't seen before, that is often the beginning of a life transformation. And that's the way that we learn this, that's called the 3 principles. It has to be realized inside of us, each in our own way. And it's not difficult. We're hardwired for insight. You've been having insights all your life about lots of other things. So the good thing about that is, as I say, you don't have to concentrate on trying to get this conceptually or intellectually. It doesn't really apply on that level. It's something that you get a feel for it. You get a sense of it. And it'll make sense to you then in your own way. Okay. So quick history lesson. Way back in about 1890, this fellow, William James, who was widely hailed as the father of psychology, certainly in the US, he said that the greatest discovery of my generation is a human being can alter his life by altering his attitude. And he wrote a book actually called The Principles of Psychology, which published in 1890. But interestingly enough, in that book, he basically said there aren't any. He was researching the field as best he could, and he was considered one of the leading experts in the field, and what he found, to his dismay, was that there were a lot of competing and conflicting theories as to why humans behave the way they do, how we end up being the way that we are, and he said none of them agree, none of them therefore can be classed as principles. Because when you really find the underlying principles, it tends to have a unifying effect on any particular field. And that certainly wasn't the case. And interestingly enough, it's still not the case to this day. So that's why we still have conflicting and competing opinions in the field of psychology and psychiatry. Fast forward, oh sorry, before we fast forward, to give you a very graphic idea about the effect of attitude on basically how the world looks to us, and even how we look to us. I came across this image which is described as the difference between women and men. You could actually change that wording and say it's what women and men have in common. Because what both parties are doing there is seeing a mirror image, but actually interpreting it through a filter, which we call thought, and thereby experiencing something different than what's actually been objectively displayed. And that's a little clue as to what the three principles are all about. It's essentially a means of getting under the skin of what we do on the inside that enables us not only to perceive the world, but to actually experience both the outer world and our inner world. Now this is interesting because I've lost a slide. Where did it go? Never mind. I'm trusting it'll come around. Now, you've probably had the experience, you go to an event, you take your best friend, you say, this is going to be great, this is my favorite movie, or we're going to watch my favorite team, or something of that kind, and they go, yeah, whatever. Why are you getting so excited about this? And it's interesting that there's a lot of things which are in our everyday experience, which we take for granted, but we haven't really seen that it's actually got deep implications. So why is it, for example, you could have two sets of supporters watching an identical game, and on one side, let's assuming one team is winning, on one side you've got people who are ecstatic, having the best time of their life. On the other side you've got people who are depressed, can't wait for it to end. And they're watching the same performance. So if we were to ask any of those people, why are you guys so happy? Or why are you guys so miserable? They will say, well, we're happy because my team's winning. And they will say, well, we're upset because we're getting thrashed. But that can't be true. In and of itself, that can't be true. Because if it were true that a winning team could really had the power to make us feel happy, everybody in that stadium should be happy, right? And equally, if it were true that a losing team could have the power to depress someone, everybody watching that should be depressed. So again, we're participating in the creation of our experience without necessarily realizing that that's what we're doing. And it looks to us, in terms of the way that we experience life, that there's all kinds of external things impinging upon us which create the experience that we're having on the inside. So if you ask people, if we went out and did a survey on the streets of Devon, what are the things that trouble you, stress you, disturb you, upset you on a daily or weekly basis? People will point to things like other people, the weather, especially here, things like my bills in London. People will always talk about the traffic, this kind of thing. And it looks and feels real to us that outside events, circumstances, and other people do have that power to make us feel a certain way. And what that requires for us then is to manipulate our circumstances so that we try and get out of the way of those things that it seems are the most troublesome. So we try and move ourselves out of the circumstances that are considered to be difficult or stressful for us, try and avoid them as best we can. And we might have to avoid certain people, hope that we don't bump into them, because we know, or we think we know, that those people have the power to upset us. You know how certain people seem to have that magic power, that they can like press a button and make you feel something that no one else seems to be able to do. And have you noticed that most of those people tend to be the ones we live with or somehow married or related to? It's not coincidental. Now, equally, you can flip that coin around. You ask people, well, what is it that would make you happy? What would bring you the most happiness, joy, peace of mind, security, contentment? people will typically also point to external things, at least at first, until you get deeper into that conversation. Well, if I had enough money, if I had the perfect relationship, if the sun shone a little bit more, if I could find the house of my dreams, get my finances sorted out, etc. Now, I learned through my work, and I'm sure many of you have learned this through your work, that if you take that a bit deeper with people, you get under the skin of that. You say, well, what do you want those things for? You know, what if people say, I want more money, I want a better job, what do you actually want that for? What do you believe that will give you that you don't have? Where does it lead? What I found was it always leads to a feeling state. Always, every single time, no exceptions. So why do you want to increase your income or have a better job? I want to feel secure. Why do you want to get the relationship sorted out? I want to feel a sense of love and harmony, connection. Why is it that you want to, let's say, live in a different place or have your own house? I want to feel a feeling of freedom. I'm feeling trapped in this situation that I'm in. You can track anything that a person says they want in the external life. I guarantee you, if you track it persistently, it will lead towards a feeling state. So I discovered this, I'm sure many of you have discovered the same thing, is that underneath what we say we want, what we really want is the feeling that we imagine that will give us. Make sense? We don't actually want things for their own purposes. What we want is what we imagine we'll end up feeling if we could have those things consistently and reliably in our life. We want the feeling state itself. Now, obviously, there's an assumption built into that those things have the power to give us the feeling, to create the feeling for us. That's the assumption. Now, this understanding that we're calling the three principles pulls the rug on that very nicely for us and helps us to see something which we intuitively already know, but it helps us to see it much more visibly, which namely is that nothing in the external world actually has the power to make us feel anything.